Every ancient Egyptian temple was dedicated to a god, one temple, one sanctuary, one priesthood, one set of rituals, one divine resident housed in one granite shrine, served by one hierarchy of priests who performed one daily ritual in one direction along one sacred axis. This is the rule. It governed the construction of every temple in the Nile Valley for 3,000 years, from the earliest shrines of the predynastic period to the last Ptolemaic constructions of the 1st century BC. One god, one temple. Every temple in Egypt follows this rule, except one, the Temple of Kom Ombo, standing on a promontory above the east bank of the Nile, roughly 45 kilometers north of Aswan, is the only ancient Egyptian temple divided down its center line to serve two gods simultaneously. Two entrances, two courtyards, two hypostyle halls, two sanctuaries, two priesthoods, two sets of rituals, two divine residents, the crocodile god Sobek on the eastern side, and the falcon god Haroeris, Horus the Elder, on the western side, worshipped under one roof, in one building, separated by an invisible line that runs from the entrance to the back wall, dividing the temple into two perfectly symmetrical halves. The symmetry is not approximate, it is exact. Every architectural element on the eastern side has its mirror on the western side. Every doorway, every column, every relief panel is duplicated. Same size, same position, same function, different god. The temple is a Rorschach test in stone. Fold it along its central axis and the two halves match perfectly. The builders achieved a precision of bilateral symmetry that would be impressive in any era, but that is astonishing in a tradition that prized axial uniformity above all other architectural values. They took the most rigid architectural system in the ancient world and split it in two, creating not a compromise, but a masterpiece of doubled design. The question is, why? Why build a double temple? Why house two gods under one roof? Why divide a building along its center line, creating a mirror world in stone, when 3,000 years of architectural tradition said that every temple should serve one god and one god only? What theological problem was the double temple designed to solve? And what does the solution tell us about the nature of Egyptian religion, the politics of the Ptolemaic period, and the capacity of ancient builders to create something that no one had ever attempted before? By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why two of the most powerful gods in the Egyptian pantheon were made to share a single building, what the walls of that building reveal about ancient medicine, ancient science, and ancient stagecraft, and why the river that the temple was built to overlook has been trying, for 2,000 years, to pull it into the water. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The city of Kom Ombo, the ancient Nubbed City of Gold, occupied a strategic position on the Nile. Located at a bend in the river where the valley widened and the surrounding desert retreated, Kom Ombo controlled the trade routes between Egypt and Nubia. Gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals passed through the city on their way north to the Egyptian markets. Military expeditions heading south to enforce Egyptian control of the Nubian frontier stopped at Kom Ombo for supplies and reinforcement. The city was a way station, a garrison, a market, and a customs post, a place where wealth accumulated, where soldiers gathered, and where the boundary between Egypt and the wild south was policed and maintained. The site had been sacred for centuries before the Ptolemies arrived. Archaeological evidence indicate settlement from the predynastic period. Old kingdom tombs have been found nearby. Fragments of New Kingdom masonry, blocks bearing the cartouches of 18th dynasty pharaohs, were recovered from the foundations of the current temple, indicating that an earlier temple stood on the site during the era of Thutmose III and his successors. Champollion, visiting the site in the early 19th century, reportedly identified fragments of an 18th dynasty gateway in the enclosure wall. The Ptolemaic builders, as was their custom, demolished the older temple and built their new one on the same sacred ground, preserving the holiness of the location while replacing the building. The construction of the current temple began around 180 BC under Ptolemy VI Philometor and continued through the reigns of subsequent Ptolemaic rulers, Ptolemy VIII Euergetes, Ptolemy XII Neos Dionysus, and others. Roman emperors, including Augustus, Tiberius, Domitian, and Trajan, added further decorations and structural elements. The temple was thus a collaborative project spanning more than 2 centuries of construction, from the mid-2nd century BC to the early 2nd century of the Common Era. Like the temples of Edfu, Dendera, and Philae, Kom Ombo is a Ptolemaic Roman temple, built by Greek kings, expanded by Roman emperors, decorated in the traditional Egyptian style, and dedicated to Egyptian gods. But unlike any other temple in Egypt, Kom Ombo was dedicated to 2 gods, and the decision to house 2 deities under one roof was not merely an architectural novelty. It was a theological statement, a political calculation, and a reflection of the specific religious geography of the region. Sobek, the crocodile god, was the dominant deity of the Como region. The stretch of the Nile near Kom Ombo was, in antiquity, infested with crocodiles, large, aggressive Nile crocodiles that posed a constant danger to fishermen, farmers, and anyone who approached the riverbank. The crocodile was feared, respected, and, in the manner typical of Egyptian religious thought, worshipped. The Egyptian attitude toward dangerous animals was not to avoid them, but to propitiate them, to transform the threat into a protector by worshipping it as a god. Sobek was the divine crocodile, the god who controlled the waters, who commanded the Nile flood, who could destroy or protect at will. Worshipping Sobek was not merely piety, it was survival strategy. A god who could command crocodiles was a god worth honoring. Haroeris, Horus the Elder, was a different kind of deity. Unlike Horus the Younger, the son of Isis and Osiris, the avenger of his father, the prototype of the living pharaoh, Horus the Elder was a primordial sky god, one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, associated with the sky, with sunlight, with the cosmic order. Haroeris was not a local god, he was a national god, worshipped across Egypt, associated with kingship, with justice, with the defeat of chaos. His presence at Kom Ombo linked the local temple to the national religious system, ensuring that the temple served not just the local population, but the broader institutional framework of Egyptian religion. The combination of Sobek and Haroeris at Kom Ombo was therefore a combination of the local and the national, the dangerous and the protective, the water and the sky, the crocodile and the falcon. The 2 gods were not natural partners. They did not share a mythology. They did not belong to the same divine family. They were brought together at Kom Ombo not by theological logic, but by geographical and political circumstance. The circumstance that the local population worshipped the crocodile god and the national religion required the presence of the falcon god. The double temple was the architectural solution to this double requirement, a building that could house both gods, serve both cults, and satisfy both constituencies without requiring either to yield to the other. The political dimension of this arrangement should not be underestimated. The Ptolemies, as foreign rulers governing an Egyptian population, were acutely sensitive to questions of religious legitimacy. They could not afford to alienate the local priesthood of Sobek, which was powerful, wealthy, and deeply rooted in the community. Nor could they afford to neglect the national cult of Horus, which was central to their claim to be legitimate pharaohs. The double temple resolved both problems simultaneously, honoring the local god without diminishing the national one, satisfying the local priesthood without offending the national establishment, creating a space in which both traditions could coexist without either one dominating the other. The symmetry of the temple was the architectural expression of this political balance. Neither god was given more space, more decoration, more prominence than the other. The eastern sanctuary of Sobek was the same size as the western sanctuary of Haroeris. The eastern hypostyle hall had the same number of columns as the western one. The eastern entrance was the same width as the western entrance. The balance was exact, not because the builders were obsessively precise, although they were, but because the political situation required it. Tilt the balance towards Sobek and the national priesthood would object. Tilt it toward Haroeris and the local priesthood would protest. The only solution was perfect equality, and perfect equality, in architectural terms, meant perfect symmetry. The theological logic of the double temple becomes clearer when we examine the specific divine triads that each side of the temple served. Sobek's side, the eastern half, was dedicated not merely to Sobek but to the triad of Sobek, Hathor, and Khonsu. Haroeris' side, the western half, was dedicated to the triad of Haroeris, Teznet Nefret, a form of Hathor meaning the good sister, and Paneptephi, a child god meaning the lord of the two lands. Each triad consisted of a father, a mother, and a divine child. The standard Egyptian divine family structure, replicated on both sides of the temple, creating two parallel but distinct theological programs within a single building. The existence of two triads meant the existence of two priesthoods. Each triad required its own core of priests, its own hierarchy of prophets, its own schedule of daily rituals, its own calendar of festivals. The priests of Sobek served the eastern side. The priests of Haroeris served the western side. The two priesthoods operated simultaneously, performing parallel rituals on parallel schedules, in parallel spaces, separated by the invisible line that divided the temple down its center. The coordination required to maintain two simultaneous ritual programs, without interference, without confusion, without one priesthood encroaching on the other's territory, must have been considerable, and yet the inscriptions suggest that the coordination was achieved smoothly over centuries, without significant conflict. The economic basis of the temple's double operation was the agricultural wealth of the Kom Ombo region. The city's ancient name, Nubt, the city of gold, refers not to the precious metal but to the golden color of the grain that grew in the surrounding fields. The Nile Valley at Kom Ombo is unusually wide, providing more cultivable land than most stretches of the upper Egyptian valley. The temple's agricultural estates, which supplied the grain, oil, and wine needed for the daily offerings and the annual festivals, were distributed across this fertile region. The wealth was sufficient to support not one but two priesthoods, a luxury that most Egyptian temples, with their more limited agricultural base, could not afford. The Ptolemaic strategy of building temples to secure priestly loyalty was nowhere more clearly demonstrated than at Kom Ombo. The Ptolemies understood that the Egyptian priesthood was the most powerful native institution in Egypt, the institution that controlled religious life, that managed agricultural wealth, that administered justice, that provided education, and that served as the mediator between the Greek-speaking court and the Egyptian-speaking population. By building temples for the priesthood, magnificent, expensive, beautifully decorated temples that enhanced the prestige and the economic power of the priestly class, the Ptolemies were not merely honoring the gods, they were investing in the institutional infrastructure of their own rule. The temples were the currency of Ptolemaic legitimacy, and at Kom Ombo the investment was doubled, 2 temples in one, serving 2 priesthoods, generating twice the priestly goodwill, at a cost that was manageable because the agricultural base of the region could support it. The construction technique at Kom Ombo was limestone, the local building material, quarried from the surrounding hills and transported to the site on wooden sledges. The limestone of the Kom Ombo region is of moderate quality, softer and more porous than the fine limestone of the Tura quarries near Cairo, but harder and more durable than the sandstone used at Edfu, Dendera and Philae. The use of limestone rather than sandstone gives Kom Ombo a distinctly different colour and texture from the other Ptolemaic temples of Upper Egypt, warmer, more golden, more responsive to the changing light of the Nile Valley. The carving technique at Kom Ombo is characteristically Ptolemaic. Deeply cut sunk relief on the exterior walls, shallower raised relief on the interior walls, with an attention to detail and a precision of execution that reflects the high standards of Ptolemaic craftsmanship. The reliefs are damaged. The Christian defacement has removed many faces, and the weathering has softened many details. But enough survives to demonstrate the quality of the original work. The figures are elegant, the proportions are correct, the hieroglyphic texts are carved with the crisp precision that characterizes the best Ptolemaic inscriptions. The calendar inscriptions at Kom Ombo, texts that recorded the dates and the rituals of the temple's festival calendar, are among the most detailed surviving records of the Ptolemaic religious year. The calendar lists dozens of festivals, each with its date, its associated rituals, its required offerings, and its liturgical texts. The festivals include celebrations dedicated to Sobek, celebrations dedicated to Haroeris, and joint celebrations honoring both gods. The architectural division of the temple into two halves did not prevent the two cults from occasionally sharing a festival. The calendar demonstrates that the two priesthoods, while maintaining separate ritual programs, were capable of collaboration, of coming together for specific occasions, sharing the sacred space, and performing joint ceremonies that honored both gods simultaneously. The question of whether the two priesthoods competed with each other, whether the priests of Sobek and the priests of Haroeris engaged in the kind of institutional rivalry that might be expected between two organizations sharing a building, is not directly answered by the surviving evidence. The inscriptions present a picture of harmony, of two cults coexisting peacefully, sharing resources equitably, and collaborating on joint festivals. But inscriptions are not neutral documents. They are official texts, produced by the institution they describe, and they are unlikely to record internal conflicts or rivalries. The harmony depicted on the walls may or may not reflect the reality of the temple's internal politics. The truth, as always in the ancient world, is probably more complex than the official record suggests. The mythology of Sobek at Kom Ombo was embedded in a broader network of crocodile cult centers that stretched across Egypt. Sobek was worshipped at Crocodilopolis, in the Fayum oasis, at Silsileh between Edfu and Kom Ombo, and at numerous smaller shrines along the Nile, where crocodiles were particularly abundant. The Fayum cult centered on the sacred lake, where enormous Nile crocodiles were kept and venerated, was the oldest and most prestigious of the Sobek cult centers. But the Kom Ombo cult had its own distinctive features. Its association with Haroeris, its double temple design, its sacred crocodile pools, and its integration of medical practice into the cult program that distinguished it from the Fayum and from every other Sobek temple in Egypt. The mummification of the sacred crocodiles was a process of considerable complexity and expense. The animals, upon death, were washed, anointed with sacred oils, and wrapped in linen bandages that were applied according to a specific protocol. Each limb wrapped separately, the tail wrapped in a spiral pattern, the jaws bound shut with a strip of linen tied in a ceremonial knot. Amulets were placed at specific points on the body, over the heart, over the eyes, at the base of the tail, in positions that corresponded to the points where protective spells were concentrated. The completed mummy was placed in a painted coffin. Some of the larger specimens received coffins of carved wood and buried in the catacombs near the temple with ritual prayers and offerings. The size range of the mummified crocodiles is extraordinary. The collection includes hatchlings only a few centimeters long, tiny, fragile, wrapped in proportionately tiny linen bandages, and massive adults exceeding 4 meters in length, their mummified bodies heavy, their jaws massive, their teeth still visible through the wrappings. The inclusion of hatchlings in the sacred collection suggests that the sacredness of the crocodile was not dependent on size or age. Every crocodile, no matter how small, contained a portion of Sobek's divine essence. Every death, no matter how insignificant, required proper mummification and burial. The theological democracy of the crocodile mummies is striking. The smallest hatchling received the same ritual treatment as the largest adult, because both were equally divine. The ecological context of the crocodile cult at Kom Ombo helps to explain its intensity. The stretch of the Nile near Kom Ombo was, in antiquity, one of the most densely populated crocodile habitats in Egypt. The river was wide, the current was slow, the sandbanks were numerous, and the surrounding marshes provided ideal nesting habitat. Crocodile attacks on humans, on fishermen, on women washing clothes at the riverbank, on children playing in the shallows, were regular and terrifying events. The worship of Sobek was, in this context, a response to a real and present danger, an attempt to manage, through ritual and devotion, a threat that could not be eliminated by any other means. The Ptolemaic builders, when they chose to house Sobek and Haroeris in a single temple, were making a political decision that was also a theological innovation. No previous Egyptian builder had attempted to combine two major gods in a single building with perfect architectural symmetry. The innovation was bold. It challenged 3,000 years of temple building tradition, and it was successful. The double temple at Kom Ombo was accepted by both the local and the national priesthood, maintained for more than 4 centuries, and expanded by Roman emperors who recognized its political utility. The acceptance of the innovation tells us something important about the flexibility of Egyptian religious thought. We tend to think of Egyptian religion as rigid, a system of fixed beliefs, unchanging rituals, and unquestioned traditions. The double temple of Kom Ombo demonstrates that Egyptian religion was in effect capable of innovation, of absorbing new ideas, of adapting to new political circumstances, of producing architectural forms that had no precedent in the tradition. The flexibility was limited. The innovation at Kom Ombo was accommodated within the framework of traditional temple architecture, not outside it. But within that framework, the builders found room to create something genuinely new, a building that no previous generation had conceived, that solved a problem that no previous generation had faced, and that demonstrated, in limestone and hieroglyph, the capacity of an ancient tradition to renew itself in response to changing circumstances. The capacity for renewal is perhaps the most important legacy of the Temple of Kom Ombo. In a tradition that prized permanence and continuity above all other values, the builders of Kom Ombo demonstrated that permanence does not require rigidity, that a tradition can innovate without betraying its principles, that a temple can serve two gods without diminishing either, and that the architectural language of ancient Egypt was flexible enough to accommodate a building that no pharaoh had ever imagined, but that any pharaoh would have recognized. The core problem of the Temple of Kom Ombo is the problem of damage, the relentless, ongoing, seemingly unstoppable destruction of a building that was designed to last forever, but that has been losing pieces of itself for 2,000 years. Kom Ombo is not as well preserved as Edfu. It is not as complete as Dendera. It is not as intact as Philae on its relocated island. Of all the major Ptolemaic temples in Upper Egypt, Kom Ombo has suffered the most damage, from earthquakes, from Nile floods, from the Christian conversion, from the reuse of its stones by local builders, and from the ongoing erosion of the riverbank on which it stands. The temple has lost its roof. It has lost most of its outer walls. It has lost significant portions of its hypostyle halls. It has lost its enclosure wall, and it continues to lose material. Each year, the Nile nibbles at the promontory on which the temple stands, undermining the foundations, eroding the bedrock, threatening to pull the entire structure into the river. The earthquakes were the first destructive force. Upper Egypt sits on a seismically active zone, the Aswan seismic zone, which has produced significant earthquakes at irregular intervals throughout recorded history. A major earthquake, its date uncertain, but probably sometime in the Roman period or later, collapsed portions of the temple's roof and toppled columns in the hypostyle halls. The rubble from the collapse was never cleared. It sat on the temple floor for centuries, gradually buried by sand and silt, until modern archaeologists excavated the site and removed the debris. The Nile was the second destructive force. The temple stands on a sandstone promontory on the east bank of the river, at a bend where the current is strong and the erosion is persistent. The promontory has been retreating for centuries, each year's flood carrying away a little more of the soft sandstone bedrock, undercutting the foundations, threatening the stability of the structures above. The eastern portion of the temple, Sobek's side, ironically the side dedicated to the god of the Nile, has been the most severely affected. Portions of the eastern outer wall have fallen into the river. The eastern gateway has been undermined, and the ongoing erosion continues to threaten the remaining structures, despite modern engineering interventions that have reinforced the riverbank with concrete and stone. And it gets worse. The Christian conversion of the 4th and 5th centuries added another layer of damage. The Christians at Kom Ombo, like Christians throughout Egypt, defaced the pagan reliefs, chipping away the faces of the gods, carving Coptic crosses into the pharaonic walls, converting portions of the temple for Christian worship. The defacement was selective, focused on the faces and the cartouches, leaving the bodies and the architectural framework intact. But it was thorough. Virtually every face on the accessible walls of the temple has been destroyed. The reuse of the temple's stones by local builders compounded the damage. After the temple fell out of use, the local population treated it as a convenient quarry, pulling blocks from the walls, using the dressed limestone for houses, granaries, and mosques. The outer walls of the temple, which were the most accessible, were the most heavily quarried. The result is that the temple's perimeter is largely gone. The enclosure wall, the outer courtyard walls, and the subsidiary structures that once surrounded the main building have been reduced to foundations and stubs. But here's the problem that makes Kom Ombo different from the other damaged temples of Egypt. The damage at Kom Ombo is not finished. It is ongoing. The Nile is still eroding the promontory. The earthquakes are still a risk. The salt weathering that affects every sandstone monument in the Nile Valley is still operating on the carved surfaces. And the tourism that brings revenue to the site also brings moisture, vibration, and physical contact that contribute to the deterioration of the remaining decorated surfaces. The conservation response has been significant. The Egyptian authorities, with international support, have reinforced the riverbank, stabilized the foundations, and conducted restoration work on the most threatened structures. But the underlying problem, the ongoing erosion of the sandstone promontory by the Nile, is a geological problem, not an engineering one. The river will continue to erode the bank. The promontory will continue to retreat, and the temple, standing on the retreating edge, will continue to be at risk. The temple's position on the riverbank, the very feature that made it visually dramatic and liturgically significant, is the feature that threatens its survival. Kom Ombo was built on the promontory because the promontory commanded the river. The temple's facades were designed to be seen from the water, by travelers, by traders, by military expeditions passing on the Nile. The position was strategic, aesthetic, and theological. The temple of the crocodile god overlooking the river of the crocodile, but the position was also vulnerable. The river that the temple was built to overlook is the river that is destroying it. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between beauty and durability. We assume that the most dramatically positioned monuments, the temples on cliff edges, the castles on headlands, the churches on eroding coastlines, are the most impressive and the most valuable. Kom Ombo proves that dramatic positioning and long-term survival are often incompatible. The most impressive position is often the most vulnerable, and the temple that commands the finest view is often the temple that the landscape is most actively trying to destroy. The history of archaeological investigation at Kom Ombo begins, like so much of Upper Egyptian archaeology, with the French expedition of 1798. The savants who accompanied Napoleon documented the temple in their monumental Description de l'Egypte, producing detailed drawings and measurements that remain valuable to scholars today. The temple was, at that time, partially buried. Sand and silt had accumulated to a depth of several meters in the courtyard and the hypostyle halls, but the upper portions of the columns and the pylon were visible, and the surviving reliefs were sufficiently legible to permit detailed documentation. The first systematic excavation was conducted by Jacques de Morgan in the 1893 to 1894 season. De Morgan cleared the sand from the interior spaces, exposed the two sanctuaries, and discovered the secret corridor that runs between them. He also documented the Nilometer and the sacred crocodile pool, and he published a preliminary account of the temple's inscriptions and decorative program. His work laid the foundation for all subsequent research at the site. The discovery of the mummified crocodiles was one of the most dramatic moments in Kom Ombo's archaeological history. The crocodile catacombs, subterranean chambers located near the temple, accessible through narrow passages cut into the bedrock, contained hundreds of mummified crocodiles of every size, from tiny hatchlings only a few centimeters long to massive adults measuring more than 4 meters. The mummies were wrapped in linen, some with extraordinary care, individual wrappings for each limb, decorative patterns woven into the linen, amulets placed at strategic points on the body. The most elaborately wrapped specimens were probably the most sacred, animals that had been specially selected, specially fed, and specially honored during their lifetime, before being mummified and buried in the catacombs with full ritual honors. The practice of keeping sacred crocodiles, feeding them, adorning them, worshipping them, and mummifying them upon death, is well documented in Egyptian religion. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, described the practice with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. The Egyptians, he wrote, kept sacred crocodiles in pools, fed them with grain and honey and roasted meat, adorned them with earrings of gold and precious stones, and mummified them with great ceremony when they died. Herodotus's account, once dismissed as fantasy by skeptical scholars, has been confirmed in every particular by the archaeological evidence from Kom Ombo and from other crocodile cult centers in Egypt. The modern crocodile museum, built adjacent to the temple complex and opened in 2012, displays a selection of the mummified crocodiles in a climate-controlled environment designed to preserve the delicate linen wrappings. The museum also contains crocodile eggs, photal crocodiles, and ritual objects associated with the Sobek cult, offering tables, votive statues, and amulets in the shape of crocodiles. The museum provides context that the temple alone cannot, explaining the theological significance of the crocodile, the ritual practices of the Sobek priesthood, and the ecological relationship between the Nile crocodile and the human communities that shared its habitat. The surgical instruments relief. The most famous and most controversial image at Kom Ombo is carved on the back wall of the outer ambulatory corridor on the northern side of the temple. The relief depicts a panel of objects arranged in rows, instruments of various shapes and sizes, some clearly recognizable, others more ambiguous. Egyptologists have identified the following objects among the depicted instruments: scalpels of varying blade sizes, a bone saw with a serrated edge, forceps with articulated jaws, hooks for retracting tissue, probes for exploring wounds, scissors, cupping vessels, and a set of scales with weights, presumably for measuring pharmaceutical dosages. The identification of these objects as surgical instruments is supported by their resemblance to known medical implements from the Greco-Roman world. Surgical instruments from Roman archaeological sites, recovered from shipwrecks, from the ruins of Pompeii, and from medical burials across the empire, bear a striking resemblance to the objects depicted at Kom Ombo. The resemblance suggests a shared medical tradition, a common toolkit used by physicians across the Greco-Roman world, depicted at Kom Ombo because the temple served a medical function that required these instruments. But the medical interpretation is not universally accepted. Some scholars have argued that the depicted objects are not surgical instruments but ritual implements, tools used in the preparation of offerings, the manufacture of temple equipment, or the performance of specific ceremonies. The argument rests on the context of the relief, its position on the wall of a temple, not of a hospital, and its association with religious rather than medical texts. The counter-argument is that the distinction between medicine and religion, which is fundamental to modern thought, was not recognized in ancient Egypt, where healing was simultaneously a medical and a religious act, performed by priests who were simultaneously physicians and liturgists. The debate is unlikely to be resolved definitively. The relief depicts objects. The objects resemble surgical instruments, but the relief does not include a caption that says, "These are surgical instruments." The identification depends on the resemblance, and resemblance, in archaeology, is always a matter of interpretation rather than proof. What the relief does demonstrate, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that the Ptolemaic Egyptians possessed and used a range of precisely made implements for some purpose that required cutting, gripping, probing, and measuring. Whether that purpose was medical, ritual, or both is a question that the evidence, as it stands, cannot conclusively answer, and the implications of this ambiguity are themselves significant. The fact that the same objects can be plausibly interpreted as either surgical instruments or ritual implements tells us something important about the nature of Egyptian temple culture, namely, that the categories of medical and religious were not separate in the Egyptian worldview. The temple was a healing institution as well as a religious one. The priests were healers as well as liturgists, and the instruments they used, whatever we choose to call them, served a function that combined the physical and the spiritual, the practical and the theological, in a way that the modern mind finds difficult to categorize. The Horus side of the temple, the western half, dedicated to Haroeris, reinforces this interpretation. Horus the Elder was associated with healing in Egyptian mythology. The Eye of Horus, the Wedget Eye, one of the most powerful symbols in Egyptian religion, was itself a healing symbol, representing the eye that was damaged during Horus's battle with Seth, and that was magically restored by the god Thoth. The restoration of the eye of Horus was, in Egyptian theology, the paradigm of all healing, the template for every act of medical intervention, the mythological precedent for every cure. A temple dedicated to Horus, the elder, would have been, by association, a temple of healing, a place where the sick came to be cured, where the wounded came to be treated, where the damaged were restored, just as the eye of Horus was restored by the magic of Thoth. The Ptolemaic dynasty's decision to build a double temple at Kom Ombo must be understood within the broader context of the dynasty's religious policy, a policy that was, at its core, an exercise in calculated syncretism. The Ptolemies were not merely tolerating Egyptian religion, they were actively shaping it, selecting which gods to promote, which temples to build, which theological narratives to support, and which to suppress. The double temple at Kom Ombo was not a neutral architectural decision. It was a political act, a deliberate intervention in the religious life of the Kom Ombo region, designed to achieve specific political objectives. The primary objective was the integration of two potentially competing religious communities. The worshippers of Sobek and the worshippers of Haroeris could, under different circumstances, have been rivals, competing for resources, for political influence, for the favor of the Ptolemaic court. By building a single temple that served both communities, the Ptolemies neutralized this potential rivalry. They created a shared space, a building in which both communities could worship, both priesthoods could operate, and both gods could be honored without either one being subordinated to the other. The double temple was, in political terms, a conflict resolution mechanism, an architectural solution to a social problem. The secondary objective was the demonstration of Ptolemaic piety. By building a temple of exceptional quality and unusual design, the Ptolemies demonstrated their commitment to Egyptian religious tradition and their willingness to invest substantial resources in the maintenance of the Egyptian priesthood. The double temple was a prestige project, a building that showcased Ptolemaic architectural ambition, Ptolemaic financial resources, and Ptolemaic theological sophistication. The building said, "We understand Egyptian religion. We respect Egyptian tradition. We are willing to build something new, something that no previous pharaoh has attempted, in the service of that tradition." The message was directed at the priesthood, but it was also directed at the Egyptian population at large. The double temple was a billboard, an advertisement for Ptolemaic legitimacy, carved in limestone, visible from the river, impressive from a distance, overwhelming up close. The military dimension of Kom Ombo's significance is also important. The city was a garrison town, a place where Ptolemaic troops were stationed to control the southern frontier and to protect the trade routes between Egypt and Nubia. The garrison included not only Egyptian soldiers, but also foreign mercenaries, Greeks, Macedonians, and others, who had been settled in the region by the Ptolemaic government. The temple served the religious needs of this diverse military community, as well as the civilian population. The dual design may have been particularly useful in this context, providing a place of worship that could accommodate both the Egyptian soldiers, who worshipped Sobek and Haroeris, and the Greek soldiers, who could identify Sobek with their own river gods and Haroeris with their own sky gods. The temple was, in this reading, a tool of military integration, as well as civilian conflict resolution, a building that helped to hold together a diverse community through the shared practice of worship. The Roman additions to the temple, the outer courtyard, the elaborate relief decoration of the exterior walls, the small chapel of Hathor, extended and enriched the building without altering its fundamental double design. The Roman emperors who worked at Kom Ombo, Augustus, Tiberius, Domitian, Trajan, were, like the Ptolemies before them, foreign rulers governing an Egyptian population. They adopted the same strategy of religious patronage that the Ptolemies had pioneered, building temples, making offerings, adopting pharaonic titles, and presenting themselves on the temple walls in the pose and the regalia of Egyptian kings. The continuity of strategy from Ptolemaic to Roman rule is visible on the walls of Kom Ombo, where the cartouches of Ptolemaic kings and Roman emperors appear side by side, separated by decades or centuries, but united by the same political calculation. That building temples in the Egyptian style was the most effective way to secure the loyalty of the Egyptian priesthood. The Roman period also saw the expansion of Kom Ombo's role as a center of healing. The surgical instruments relief, carved during the Roman period on the back wall of the outer ambulatory, may reflect an expansion of the temple's medical function under Roman rule. The Romans, with their own sophisticated medical tradition, may have recognized and encouraged the healing activities that the temple had always performed. The result was a temple that served simultaneously as a religious institution, a healing center, a military garrison, a fiscal administration, and a political symbol, a building that performed multiple functions simultaneously, each one reinforcing the others, each one contributing to the temple's central role in the life of the Kom Ombo community. The sunset experience at Kom Ombo, one of the most celebrated in Egyptian tourism, transforms the temple from an archaeological site into a visual spectacle. The temple faces roughly north, with the Nile to the west, and the late afternoon sun strikes the limestone columns and walls at an oblique angle that emphasizes the depth of the carved reliefs and the warmth of the stone. The golden light, the dark river, the silhouetted palms, and the ruined columns create a scene of extraordinary beauty, a beauty that is enhanced, rather than diminished by the temple's damaged condition. The ruin, bathed in golden light, acquires an aesthetic power that an intact building might not possess. The broken columns become more evocative than whole ones. The damaged walls become more atmospheric than perfect ones. And the gap between what the building was and what it is, the visible record of 2,000 years of damage, becomes, paradoxically, the source of the building's beauty. This paradox, that ruin is more beautiful than perfection, is not unique to Kom Ombo. It is a principle that the Romantic movement articulated in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that has shaped Western attitudes toward ancient monuments ever since. The Romantics valued ruins because ruins express the passage of time, the fragility of human achievement, the ultimate triumph of nature over art. An intact building was merely a building. A ruin was a meditation, a visual poem about impermanence, about loss, about the melancholy beauty of things that were once great and are now fragments. Kom Ombo embodies this romantic ideal more completely than any other temple in Upper Egypt. The building is sufficiently intact to be comprehensible. The plan is readable, the double design is visible, the reliefs are legible, but it is sufficiently damaged to be evocative. The missing roof, the fallen columns, the eroded walls, the encroaching river, the combination of comprehensibility and damage creates an experience that is unique to Kom Ombo, an experience of understanding and loss, of knowledge and mystery, of seeing what was and knowing what is gone. The seismic vulnerability of the Kom Ombo region is a geological fact that has shaped the temple's history more profoundly than any human action. The Aswan seismic zone, which extends along the upper Egyptian Nile Valley, is one of the most active seismic areas in North Africa. The zone has produced significant earthquakes at irregular intervals throughout the historical period, including a magnitude 5.9 earthquake in 1981 that caused damage to structures in the Aswan region, and that served as a reminder that the geological forces that have shaped the Nile Valley are still active. The earthquake damage at Kom Ombo is visible throughout the temple. Columns that once supported the roof lie on the ground in their constituent drums, cylindrical sections of limestone, each one carved and fitted with precision, now scattered like the vertebrae of a giant stone spine. Walls that once defined the temple's interior spaces have collapsed outward, their blocks tumbling down the slope of the promontory toward the river. The roof, the massive stone slabs that once covered the hypostyle halls and the sanctuaries, has fallen inward, its fragments littering the floor of the building they once protected. The collapse of the roof was the most destructive consequence of the earthquake damage. The roof of an Egyptian temple served multiple functions. It protected the interior from rain, rare but destructive in Upper Egypt. It maintained the darkness of the inner chambers, essential for the performance of the daily ritual, and it supported the ceiling decoration, astronomical paintings, divine images, and cosmic symbols that were among the most elaborate artistic programs in the temple. The loss of the roof at Kom Ombo meant the loss of the ceiling decoration, the loss of the interior darkness, and the exposure of the inner chambers to the destructive effects of rain, sun, and temperature cycling. The exposure of the interior to the elements has accelerated the deterioration of the carved and painted surfaces. The sandstone and limestone of the temple absorb water from occasional rainstorms, rare in Upper Egypt but not unknown, and the absorbed water carries dissolved salts into the stone. As the water evaporates, the salts crystallize near the surface, generating mechanical stresses that cause the stone to flake and spall. This salt weathering process, which operates at every exposed sandstone monument in Egypt, has been particularly destructive at Kom Ombo, because the loss of the roof removed the protective barrier that would have prevented rainwater from reaching the carved surfaces. The conservation response to this ongoing deterioration has been multifaceted. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, working with international partners, has stabilized the most threatened structures, reinforcing foundations, repairing fractured walls, and consolidating deteriorating surfaces. The riverbank has been reinforced with concrete retaining walls and stone armor designed to resist the erosive force of the current. And the site has been equipped with modern infrastructure, drainage systems, visitor pathways, and lighting that both protects the monument and facilitates tourism. But the conservation challenge at Kom Ombo is fundamentally different from the challenge at Edfu or Dendera or Fayalai. Those temples are largely intact. Their problems are problems of slow deterioration, the gradual fading of paint, the progressive erosion of carved surfaces, the imperceptible loss of material that occurs over centuries. Kom Ombo's problems are problems of active destruction, the ongoing erosion of the riverbank, the continuing risk of earthquake damage, the progressive collapse of structural elements that were destabilized by past earthquakes, and that may fail at any time. The river erosion is the most immediate threat. The Nile at Kom Ombo flows in a wide bend, a meander that sweeps past the base of the promontory with considerable force. The outer bank of a river meander is always the erosion bank, the bank where the current is fastest, where the water cuts deepest, where the land is most actively being removed. Kom Ombo sits on the outer bank. The current is eating the promontory, and the promontory, which supports the temple, is retreating. The rate of retreat is not uniform. It varies with the river's flow, faster during high water, slower during low water. It varies with the composition of the bedrock, faster through soft sandstone, slower through harder limestone layers. And it varies with the presence or absence of engineering interventions, the concrete retaining walls and stone armor that have been installed to slow the erosion. But the underlying process is relentless. The river is a geological force. It has been eroding the bank at Kom Ombo for millennia. It eroded the bank before the temple was built. It has been eroding the bank since the temple was built, and it will continue to erode the bank after the temple is gone. The math is striking. The temple has been standing for roughly 2,200 years. The river has been eroding the bank for that entire period. The original temple may have stood significantly further from the river's edge than it does today, meaning that the promontory has retreated by tens of meters over the course of the temple's existence. The eastern portion of the temple, Sobek's side, the side facing the river, has been the most severely affected. Portions of the eastern outer wall have fallen into the river. The eastern courtyard has been undercut, and the ongoing erosion threatens the remaining eastern structures with eventual collapse. The temple of the river god is being consumed by the river. This is not a metaphor. It is a geological process, measurable, predictable, and, in the long run, unstoppable. The conservation interventions can slow the process. They cannot stop it. The river will continue to flow, the bank will continue to erode, and the temple will continue to retreat, losing material, losing structures, losing the eastern portions of the building that are closest to the water. The question is not whether the temple will eventually be consumed. The question is when, and the answer, decades, centuries, millennia, depends on factors that no one can predict with certainty. The rate of erosion, the frequency of earthquakes, the level of investment in conservation, the political will to maintain the site. Each of these variables is uncertain. Each of them can change. And the temple, standing on its retreating promontory, facing the river that is consuming it, housing the gods whose worship ended 2,000 years ago, waits for the outcome with the patience of stone. The military significance of Kom Ombo during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods adds another dimension to the temple's history. The city served as a garrison town, a place where troops were stationed to control the southern frontier and to protect the trade routes between Egypt and Nubia. The Ptolemies established a military colony at Kom Ombo, settling Greek and Macedonian veterans in the region and providing them with agricultural land in exchange for military service. These military colonists, known as kleruks, formed a significant portion of the local population and added a distinctly Greek cultural element to the otherwise Egyptian community. The presence of the military colony influenced the temple's religious program. The Greek colonists brought their own religious traditions, their own gods, their own rituals, their own mythological narratives. The Ptolemaic policy of Interpretatio Graeca, the systematic identification of Egyptian gods with their Greek equivalents, facilitated the integration of Greek and Egyptian religious practices. Sobek was identified with the Greek river god or with aspects of Poseidon. Heraeris was identified with Apollo, the Greek god of the sun and of healing. These identifications allowed the Greek colonists to worship at the Egyptian temple without abandoning their own cultural identity, to see in the Egyptian gods the faces of the Greek gods they had brought from their homeland. The dual nature of the temple may have been particularly useful in this multicultural context. A Greek colonist who identified Heraeris with Apollo could worship on the western side of the temple, finding in the Egyptian reliefs and the Egyptian rituals a familiar divine presence that was simultaneously Greek and Egyptian. An Egyptian farmer who worshipped Sobek could worship on the eastern side, secure in the knowledge that the crocodile god was honored in his own right, not merely as a translation of a Greek deity. The double temple, in this reading, was not merely a solution to a theological problem. It was a solution to a cultural problem, the problem of maintaining a multicultural community in which Greeks and Egyptians worshipped different gods, spoke different languages, and followed different cultural traditions. The Roman period extended and deepened this multicultural character. Roman soldiers, administrators, and merchants joined the Greek colonists and the Egyptian population, adding another cultural layer to the already complex community. The Roman additions to the temple, the outer courtyard, the elaborate relief decoration, the expansion of the medical program, reflected the Roman administration's commitment to maintaining the temple as a functioning institution. The Romans, like the Ptolemies before them, understood that the temple was not merely a religious building, it was an instrument of governance, a tool for managing the religious, economic, and social life of a diverse frontier community. The temple's role as a center of healing, attested by the surgical instruments relief and by the association of Heraeris with medical practice, may have been particularly important in the military context. Garrison towns required medical services. Soldiers required treatment for injuries sustained in training and in combat. And the temple, with its trained priesthood, its pharmaceutical knowledge, and its collection of medical instruments, may have served as the community's primary healthcare facility, a hospital and a temple combined, treating the sick and the wounded with a combination of medical and magical techniques that the Egyptian tradition considered complementary rather than contradictory. The integration of medicine and religion at Kom Ombo is one of the temple's most distinctive features and one of the most difficult for modern visitors to understand. Modern Western thought separates medicine from religion, treating the two as fundamentally different activities, governed by different principles, practiced by different professionals in different institutions. The Egyptians did not make this separation. For them, illness was simultaneously a physical and a spiritual condition. Treatment required both physical intervention, surgery, pharmacology, bandaging, and spiritual intervention, prayer, ritual, magical formulae. The priest-physician of Kom Ombo was not a confused practitioner who mixed science with superstition. He was a specialist in a holistic system of healing that address the whole person, body and spirit, physical symptoms and cosmic causes, the injury that the scalpel could reach, and the spiritual disruption that only the gods could repair. The crocodile was itself associated with healing in Egyptian medical tradition. Crocodile fat was used as a base for pharmaceutical preparations. Crocodile bile was believed to have therapeutic properties, and the crocodile's association with the Nile, the river whose waters were believed to possess healing properties, connected the animal to the broader Egyptian tradition of hydrotherapy, in which bathing in sacred water was prescribed as a treatment for various ailments. The sacred crocodile pool at a Kom Ombo may have served a medical as well as a religious function, a place where patients could immerse themselves in water that was simultaneously natural, Nile water, flowing through the tunnel, and sacred, water consecrated by the presence of the divine animal. The bath was the treatment, the crocodile was the physician, and the temple was the hospital, the institution that brought the patient, the water, and the god together in a single therapeutic encounter. The integration of all these functions, military, medical, religious, economic, social, in a single institution is the defining characteristic of the Egyptian temple. And the temple of Kom Ombo, with its double design, its surgical instruments, its nilometer, its sacred crocodile pool, its oracle corridor, and its garrison town location, is the most comprehensive example of this integrated institutional model in the Ptolemaic period. The temple was not one thing, it was everything. The church, the hospital, the bank, the courthouse, the community centre, the weather station, and the military headquarters of ancient Kom Ombo, all housed in a single building, all served by a single priesthood, all dedicated to two gods whose combined authority encompassed every aspect of the community's life. Walk through the temple of Kom Ombo as a visitor would, arriving, as most visitors do, from the river. The temple is visible from the Nile for several kilometers, its remaining columns and walls rising above the promontory, silhouetted against the sky, catching the late afternoon light that turns the limestone to gold. Most visitors arrive by Nile cruise ship, docking at the landing stage below the temple and climbing the stone stairway to the entrance. The approach from below, looking up at the temple, framed by palm trees, with the Nile stretching behind you, is one of the most dramatic in Egyptian archaeology. Enter through what remains of the outer gateway. The gateway is damaged, its upper portions have collapsed, and the surrounding walls have been quarried, but enough survives to show the original scale. Beyond the gateway lies the outer courtyard, built primarily under the Roman Emperor Augustus. The courtyard is flanked by columns, some standing, some fallen, and its walls, where they survive, are decorated with offering scenes showing the emperor in pharaonic regalia, making offerings to Sobek and Haroeris. The most famous relief at Kom Ombo is carved on the back wall of the outer corridor, behind the sanctuaries. It depicts a collection of what appear to be surgical instruments: scalpels, bone saws, forceps, dental probes, retractor hooks, scissors, and scales for weighing medical dosages. The relief has been described as the oldest known depiction of surgical instruments in the world, and it has generated intense scholarly debate about the medical knowledge and practices of the Ptolemaic priesthood. The interpretation of the surgical instruments relief is not straightforward. Some scholars argue that the objects depicted are indeed surgical tools, indicating that the temple functioned, at least in part, as a medical center, a place where priests with medical training treated the sick and injured using instruments that are recognizably similar to their modern equivalents. Other scholars are more cautious, suggesting that the objects may be ritual implements rather than surgical tools, or that the relief may depict a standardized set of offerings rather than a functioning medical kit. The debate is unresolved, and the relief continues to be studied and reinterpreted by successive generations of scholars. But here's what is not debated. The relief exists. It is carved on the wall of a 2,000-year-old temple, and the objects it depicts, whatever their specific function, bear a striking resemblance to modern surgical instruments. The scalpels look like scalpels. The forceps look like forceps. The scissors look like scissors. The resemblance is not accidental. It reflects a continuity of form between ancient and modern medical implements that is, at the very least, suggestive. suggestive of a medical tradition that was older, more sophisticated, and more instrumentally equipped than we might expect from a society that is often characterized, incorrectly, as exclusively religious in its approach to healing. The numbers are striking. The relief depicts more than 30 individual instruments, arranged in rows, each one carved with sufficient detail to be identified by modern physicians and medical historians. The diversity of the instruments suggests a range of procedures: cutting, gripping, probing, measuring, weighing. That implies a systematic approach to medical intervention. This is not folk medicine. This is not magical healing. This is instrumental medicine. Medicine practiced with purpose-made tools, designed for specific procedures, produced by specialist craftsmen for use by trained practitioners. The Nilometer at Kom Ombo, located outside the northern wall of the temple, is another feature of exceptional interest. The Nilometer is a deep, circular stone well, roughly 16 meters deep, connected to the Nile by a series of underground tunnels. The walls of the well are inscribed with calibrated marks that allowed the priests to measure the height of the Nile's water level during the annual flood. The measurement was not merely scientific, it was economic. The height of the flood determined the extent of the agricultural land that would be irrigated, which in turn determined the size of the harvest, which in turn determined the tax rate that would be imposed on the farming population. The nilometer was, in modern terms, a fiscal forecasting tool, an instrument for predicting the tax base, carved in stone, operated by priests, and connected to the Nile by engineering. The sacred crocodile pool, located near the nilometer, was an artificial pond where living crocodiles were kept, fed, and honoured as manifestations of Sobek. The pool was connected to the Nile by a tunnel that allowed fresh water to circulate. The crocodiles were treated as divine animals, fed with meat and honey, adorned with jewellery, and, upon their death, mummified with the same care and reverence that was accorded to human burials. The mummified crocodiles, hundreds of them, ranging from tiny hatchlings to massive adults more than 4 meters long, were discovered in catacombs near the temple and are now displayed in the Crocodile Museum, a modern facility built adjacent to the temple complex. The Crocodile Museum is one of the most unusual museums in Egypt. Its collection consists almost entirely of mummified crocodiles, wrapped in linen, preserved by the dry climate, displayed in glass cases under controlled lighting. The mummies are remarkable objects, the linen wrappings still intact, the bodies still articulated, the teeth still visible through the wrappings. The largest specimens are genuinely frightening. Massive predators, preserved in the posture of life, their jaws slightly open, their eyes replaced by painted stones, their bodies adorned with the amulets and jewellery that the priests placed on them at the time of mummification. The secret corridor that runs between the two sanctuaries is one of the most intriguing architectural features at Kom Ombo. The corridor, narrow, dark and accessible only from behind the sanctuary wall, allowed a priest to pass unseen from one sanctuary to the other. Its purpose, according to some scholars, was oracular. A priest exiled and seal the corridor could speak through openings in the sanctuary wall, delivering the god's response to questions posed by worshippers in the sanctuary. The voice, emerging from the darkness behind the sacred shrine, would have seemed to come from the god himself, a divine oracle speaking through the stone, delivering verdicts and prophecies to the faithful. The oracular function of the secret corridor connects Kom Ombo to a broader tradition of temple oracles in Ptolemaic Egypt. Several temples from this period, including Edfu and Dendera, contain architectural features that appear to have been designed for oracular pronouncements. The Ptolemaic temples were not merely houses of worship, they were centres of divination, places where the faithful could pose questions to the gods and receive answers, delivered through the medium of priestly ventriloquism and architectural stagecraft. The temples were, in modern terms, theatrical spaces, buildings designed to create the illusion of divine communication through the manipulation of architecture, acoustics, and performance. The crocodile theology at Kom Ombo was more sophisticated and more philosophically ambitious than the simple equation of dangerous animal equals God to be propitiated might suggest. Sobek was not merely a dangerous god who needed to be appeased. He was a creative god, a god who was associated with the very act of creation, who was believed to have risen from the primordial waters at the beginning of time, whose sweat formed the rivers and whose breath formed the winds. In some versions of the Egyptian creation myth, it was Sobek, not Amun, not Ra, not Ptah, who was the first god, the creator who brought the world into being through the exercise of his will. This creative dimension of Sobek's character is reflected in the reliefs on the eastern side of the Kom Ombo temple, where the god is depicted not merely as a crocodile-headed figure receiving offerings, but as a cosmic being, associated with the sun, with fertility, with the regeneration of life after death. Sobek's association with the Nile flood was particularly important. The annual flood was the event on which the entire Egyptian agricultural economy depended. If the flood was too low, the crops would fail and famine would follow. If the flood was too high, the settlements would be inundated and destruction would follow. The ideal flood, the flood that was just right, that watered the fields without destroying the villages, was the gift of Sobek. The god controlled the water. The god determined whether Egypt would prosper or starve. And the worship of Sobek, the daily rituals, the annual festivals, the care of the sacred crocodiles, was the means by which the human community sought to influence the god's decision. The keeping of sacred crocodiles at Kom Ombo was the most vivid expression of this theology. The crocodiles were not merely symbolic of Sobek, they were Sobek, actual, physical manifestations of the god, living in the temple precinct, fed by the priests, worshipped by the community. Each sacred crocodile was believed to contain a portion of the god's divine essence. The larger and older the crocodile, the more divine essence it contained. The death of a sacred crocodile was not merely the death of an animal, it was the departure of a piece of the divine. A fragment of Sobek's essence, returning to the cosmic source from which it had come. The mummification of the dead crocodile was the means by which this divine departure was honoured and commemorated. The linen wrappings preserving the body that had housed the god, the ritual burial ensuring that the divine essence was properly directed toward its cosmic destination. The crocodile pool, the artificial pond where the sacred animals were kept, was positioned near the temple's entrance, visible to anyone who approached the building. The pool was connected to the Nile by a tunnel that allowed fresh water to circulate, maintaining the health of the animals, and symbolically connecting the sacred pool to the sacred river. The crocodiles in the pool were treated with extraordinary care, fed with meat and grain, protected from harm, adorned with jewelry that identified them as divine animals. The feeding of the sacred crocodiles was itself a ritual act, performed by priests at prescribed times, using prescribed foods, accompanied by prescribed prayers. The meal was an offering. The crocodile was a god, and the act of feeding the god was as liturgically significant as the act of offering food to the statue in the sanctuary. The relationship between the living crocodiles in the pool and the cult statue in the sanctuary was complex. Both were manifestations of Sobek, both received offerings, both were tended by priests, but they served different functions within the temple's theological program. The cult statue was the permanent, unchanging, eternal manifestation, the golden or gilded image that resided in the dark sanctuary, that was washed and dressed each morning, that received the formal daily offerings, that represented the god in his most abstract and most cosmic form. The living crocodiles were the temporary, changing, mortal manifestations, physical animals, born, growing, dying, replaced by new animals, representing the god in his most concrete and most immediate form. The cult statue was the idea of Sobek, the crocodiles were the reality of Sobek, and the temple, housing both, provided a setting in which the abstract and the concrete, the eternal and the mortal, the idea and the animal could coexist. This coexistence of the abstract and the concrete is one of the most distinctive features of Egyptian religion, and one of the most difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. We tend to think of religious images as symbols, representations of something that is not physically present, pointers toward a reality that exists beyond the material world. The Egyptians thought differently. For them, the cult statue was not a symbol, it was the god. The sacred crocodile was not a symbol, it was the god. The distinction between representation and reality, which is fundamental to modern religious thought, did not exist in Egyptian theology. The image was the reality, the animal was the god, and the temple was the place where this identity between the material and the divine was maintained, celebrated, and renewed. The destruction of this identity, the Christian insistence that images were merely images, that animals were merely animals, that the divine could not be contained in material form, was the theological revolution that ended the ancient Egyptian religious system. The Christians did not merely close the temples, they demolished the identity between the material and the divine that the temples were designed to maintain. They smashed the statues, not because they thought the statues were beautiful, but because they thought the statues were alive. They defaced the reliefs, not because they thought the reliefs were art, but because they thought the reliefs were idols. They killed the sacred animals, not because they thought the animals were dangerous, but because they thought the animals were gods. The destruction was theological. It was an assault on a metaphysical principle, the principle that the divine could be materially present, that a god could inhabit a statue, that a crocodile could be the embodiment of a cosmic being. The Christians rejected this principle, the Egyptians held it, and the conflict between the two, the conflict between the materialist theology of Egypt and the immaterialist theology of Christianity, was played out on the walls, the statues, and the sacred animals of temples like Kom Ombo. The Christians won, the statues were smashed, the crocodiles were killed, and the principle that had sustained Egyptian religion for 3 millennia, the principle that the divine was materially present in the material world, was extinguished. Not disproven, not refuted, simply suppressed, by imperial decree, by military force, by the chisels that chipped the faces from the walls, and the swords that killed the sacred animals in their pools. The Nilometer at Kom Ombo represents a sophisticated integration of science, economics, and theology that was characteristic of Egyptian temple culture. The well itself, 16 meters deep, cut into the bedrock, lined with dressed stone, connected to the Nile by 3 underground tunnels, was an impressive piece of hydraulic engineering. The tunnels allowed Nile water to enter the well and rise to the same level as the river outside, providing a convenient and accurate means of measuring the water height without requiring direct access to the riverbank. The calibrated marks on the well walls, scratched or carved at regular intervals, indicating the water level in cubits, allowed the priests to read the height of the flood with precision. The readings were taken daily during the flood season, from roughly June to September in the modern calendar, and the results were reported to the temple administration and, through them, to the provincial government. The flood height determined the agricultural yield, which determined the tax assessment, which determined the temple's revenue for the coming year. The Nilometer was, in the most literal sense, a revenue forecasting tool, a fiscal instrument, disguised as a religious structure, operated by priests who were simultaneously scientists, economists, and liturgists. The connection between the Nilometer and the temple's religious program was explicit. The flood was a divine event, the gift of the Nile gods, the annual demonstration of cosmic generosity that sustained the entire Egyptian agricultural economy. The priests who read the Nilometer were not merely taking measurements. They were reading the will of the gods, interpreting a divine message, encoded in the height of the water, about the prosperity or hardship that the coming year would bring. A high flood was a sign of divine favor, a low flood was a sign of divine displeasure, and the ritual response, the offerings, the prayers, the festivals, was calibrated to the message. A good flood required thanksgiving, a bad flood required propitiation. The Nilometer told the priests what the gods were saying, the priests told the people, and the people responded with the appropriate rituals, celebrating or lamenting, feasting or fasting, according to the height of the water in the well. The oracle corridor at Kom Ombo, the narrow passage that runs behind the 2 sanctuaries, connecting them through the thickness of the back wall, raises questions about the nature of priestly authority that are as relevant today as they were in the Ptolemaic period. The corridor is designed to be invisible from the sanctuaries. Its entrance is hidden behind relief panels that blend with the surrounding decoration. A priest concealed in the corridor could observe activities in either sanctuary through small openings in the wall, and could speak through the openings in a voice that, to a worshipper in the sanctuary, would appear to emanate from the shrine itself, from the god, not from a human intermediary. The use of this corridor for oracular pronouncements is inferred rather than documented. No inscription at Kom Ombo explicitly describes the oracular procedure, but the architectural evidence is suggestive. The corridor exists, the openings exist, the concealment is deliberate, and the tradition of temple oracles, of priests delivering divine messages through architectural devices, is well documented at other Ptolemaic temples. At Edfu, a window of appearances allowed the priests to display the cult statue to worshippers in the courtyard. At Dendera, a rooftop chapel was used for astronomical observations that may have been presented as oracular revelations. The use of architectural stagecraft, of buildings designed to create the illusion of divine communication, was a standard feature of Ptolemaic temple design. The ethical question, whether the priests were deliberately deceiving the worshippers, or whether they understood themselves as genuinely transmitting divine messages, is probably unanswerable. The modern tendency is to assume deception, to see the oracle corridor as evidence of priestly fraud, of cynical manipulation, of religion as a tool of social control. But this assumption imposes a modern dichotomy between sincerity and deception that may not have been recognized in the ancient world. The priest who spoke through the wall may have genuinely believed that he was transmitting the god's will, that the god was speaking through him, using him as a medium, and that the architectural device was merely the channel through which the divine message was delivered. The priest was not the message. He was the telephone. The comparison with modern religious practices is instructive. Many contemporary religious traditions involve practices that, viewed from the outside, might appear to be performances or deceptions. Speaking in tongues, prophetic utterance, possession by spirits, the interpretation of signs and omens. The practitioners of these traditions typically do not experience them as performances. They experience them as genuine encounters with the divine, encounters in which the human medium is temporarily displaced by a divine presence that speaks through them. The Ptolemaic oracle tradition at Kom Ombo may have been understood in similar terms, not as a performance, not as a deception, but as a genuine channel of divine communication, facilitated by architecture, enabled by stagecraft, and validated by the faith of the community. The secret corridor at Kom Ombo is, in this reading, not a tool of deception, but a tool of theology, an architectural device for creating the conditions under which divine communication could take place. The corridor created the darkness, the openings created the voice, the concealment created the mystery, and the mystery, the sense that the god was speaking, that the shrine was alive, that the divine will was being communicated through the stone, was the theological product of the architecture. The building created the experience sustained the faith, and the faith, the community's trust in the divine communication, their confidence that the god was present and attentive and responsive, was the foundation on which the entire temple system rested. The hypostyle halls at Kom Ombo, there are two, an outer and an inner, following the standard Ptolemaic temple plan, deserve attention for their decorative programs, which provide the clearest visual expression of the temple's dual theology. In the outer hypostyle hall, the columns are divided along the central axis, those on the western side bearing reliefs and inscriptions related to the cult of Hareris, those on the eastern side bearing reliefs and inscriptions related to the cult of Sobek. The division is systematic. The gods on the left are falcon-headed, the gods on the right are crocodile-headed. The offering scenes on the left show the pharaoh presenting to Haroeris and his consort, Tasnet Nofret. The offering scenes on the right show the pharaoh presenting to Sobek and his consort Hathor. The division runs through every register, every panel, every column, a continuous, unbroken line of theological separation that transforms the hypostyle hall into a textbook of comparative theology. The inner hypostyle hall, smaller, darker, and more restricted in access, continues the division but with greater intimacy. The scenes here depict not the public rituals of the outer hall, but the private rituals of the inner temple, the preparation of offerings, the manufacture of sacred objects, The consecration of ritual equipment. The reliefs are more detailed, more specific, more technical than those in the outer hall, reflecting the specialized nature of the activities that took place in this deeper, more restricted space. Between the inner hypostyle hall and the sanctuaries lies a series of small chambers, offering rooms, storage rooms, and ritual preparation rooms that served the practical needs of the temple's daily operations. These chambers, though small and utilitarian, are richly decorated, their walls covered with scenes that describe, in exhaustive detail, the procedures for preparing the daily offerings, manufacturing the sacred objects, and maintaining the temple's ritual equipment. The scenes are prescriptive. They are not merely descriptions of what was done, but instructions for how it should be done. They are the operational manuals of the temple, the maintenance handbooks, carved in stone, permanent and unchangeable. The back wall of the temple, the wall behind the two sanctuaries, is one of the most unusual features at Kom Ombo. Unlike most Egyptian temples, where the back wall is a simple, undecorated surface, the back wall at Kom Ombo is carved with elaborate reliefs that include the famous surgical instruments panel, a series of offering scenes, and, most notably, a relief showing the Emperor Trajan making offerings to the gods in the presence of a set of what appear to be medical or ritual implements. Trajan reliefs on the back wall are among the latest additions to the temple, dating to the early 2nd century of the Common Era, roughly 300 years after the temple's construction began. Trajan's presence at Kom Ombo is not surprising. The emperor was a prolific builder throughout the Roman Empire, and his patronage of Egyptian temples was consistent with the broader Roman policy of maintaining the Egyptian priesthood as a pillar of provincial governance. But the specific content of Trajan's reliefs, his association with the surgical instruments panel, his depiction in the context of healing and medical practice, suggests that the temple's medical function may have been particularly important during the Roman period, and that the emperor himself may have been associated with the temple's healing activities. The approach to the temple from the river is one of the most dramatic in Upper Egyptian archaeology. Nile cruise ships dock at a landing stage directly below the temple, and passengers ascend a long stone stairway that climbs the face of the promontory. The ascent is theatrical. The temple emerges gradually above the visitor's line of sight, the columns and walls appearing one by one as the stairway rises. The final step brings the visitor to the level of the temple's forecourt, where the full extent of the building is suddenly visible. The columns, the walls, the twin entrances, the central axis running straight through the building, from front to back, the two sanctuaries at the far end, side by side, facing the visitor with their twin doorways. The experience of the twin entrances is one of the defining moments of a visit to Kom Ombo. The visitor stands at the entrance to the temple and faces a choice: left or right, Harrow Eris or Sobek, falcon or crocodile, sky or water. The choice is not consequential. Both sides lead to the same interior, and the visitor can freely cross the central axis at any point. But the choice is symbolically significant. It invites the visitor to consider the duality that the temple represents. The two gods, the two forces, the two aspects of the cosmos that the building was designed to contain. The visitor who chooses to enter on the Harrow side enters a world of sky, order, and protection. The visitor who chooses to enter on the Sobek side enters a world of water, danger, and fertility. Both worlds are the same building. Both gods are the same cosmos. And the visitor, standing at the threshold, is invited to experience, however briefly, however superficially, the Egyptian sense of cosmic duality that the temple was built to express. The column capitals at Kom Ombo, like those at Edfu and Dendera, are characteristically Ptolemaic, elaborate composite designs that combine multiple botanical motifs in a single composition. But the capitals at Kom Ombo have a distinctive local character that distinguishes them from those at other Ptolemaic temples. The carving is slightly rougher, the compositions are slightly less refined, and the variety is slightly less ambitious. These differences reflect the different quality of the local limestone, harder and less amenable to fine carving than the sandstone used at Edfu, and the different artistic traditions of the Kom Ombo workshop. The capitals are still beautiful, but they are beautiful in a different way from those at Edfu or Dendera, more robust, more muscular, more closely connected to the material from which they are carved. The preservation of the painted decoration at Kom Ombo is patchy. The loss of the roof exposed the interior surfaces to weathering, and much of the original paint has faded or flaked away, but traces survive, particularly in the deeper recesses of the building, where overhanging stonework has provided some protection from the sun and rain. The surviving traces show the standard Ptolemaic colour palette: reds, blues, yellows, greens, and whites, applied to a thin layer of gypsum plaster over the carved limestone surface. The colours are muted now, faded by 20 centuries of exposure, but they provide enough evidence to suggest what the temple would have looked like when new. A building ablaze with colour, every surface painted, every figure outlined, every hieroglyph filled with pigment. The monochrome ruin that visitors see today is a ghost of the original, a faded photograph of a once vivid painting, a whisper of a once clear voice. The deeper truth of the Temple of Kom Ombo is the truth about duality, about the Egyptian capacity to hold two opposing ideas simultaneously and to find, in their coexistence, a principle of cosmic order. Sobek and Haroeris were not merely different gods, they were opposite gods. Sobek was the god of the water, the Nile, the flood, the dangerous, unpredictable, life-giving, death-dealing river that was the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Haroeris was the god of the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, the ordered, predictable cosmic dome that arched over the world and that represented the triumph of order over chaos, water and sky, danger and protection, unpredictability and order. The two gods represented the fundamental duality of the Egyptian cosmos, the tension between the forces that sustained life and the forces that threatened it. The double temple was the architectural expression of this duality. By housing both gods under one roof, the builders of Kom Ombo were making a theological statement that the cosmos is not singular, it is dual. It contains both order and chaos, both the sky and the water, both the falcon and the crocodile. And the temple, the building that mediates between the human and the divine, must contain both as well. A temple that housed only Haroeris would be incomplete. A temple that housed only Sobek would be unbalanced. Only a double temple, a building that held both gods in equal measure, in perfect symmetry, could represent the full complexity of the cosmos. This is not science fiction. This is Egyptian theology, a theological system that was comfortable with paradox, that embraced contradiction, that found wisdom, not in the resolution of opposites but in their coexistence. The Egyptians did not believe that order would eventually triumph over chaos. They believed that order and chaos were permanent, necessary, and interdependent. Chaos was not a problem to be solved, it was a force to be managed, contained, propitiated, balanced against the force of order. And the temple, any temple, but especially the double temple of Kom Ombo, was the instrument of that management. The temple was the balance point, the fulcrum, the place where the two forces met and were held in equilibrium. Let that sink in. The Temple of Kom Ombo is not merely an architectural curiosity, a double temple, an oddity, a one-off experiment in bilateral symmetry. It is a philosophical statement, a statement about the nature of reality, about the structure of the cosmos, about the relationship between opposing forces. The building is the argument, the symmetry is the thesis, and the thesis that the cosmos is dual, that order and chaos are interdependent, that the temple must contain both, is carved in stone on 200 meters of temple wall in the most enduring medium available to the ancient mind. And the thesis is still legible, despite the earthquakes, the floods, the quarrying, the defacement, and the erosion, despite 2,000 years of damage that have reduced the temple from a complete building to a dramatic ruin. The thesis survives. The two sanctuaries are still identifiable. The two hypostyle halls are still distinguishable. The central axis is still visible, dividing the temple into its two symmetrical halves. The building has been damaged, the argument has not. And the argument, the claim that the cosmos is dual, that opposites coexist, that the temple must contain both the falcon and the crocodile, is as readable in the ruins as it was in the intact building. The Egyptian concept of duality, The idea that reality consists of paired opposites held in creative tension is one of the most fundamental and most misunderstood principles in Egyptian thought. Modern Western thought tends to see duality as a problem, a conflict between opposing forces that must be resolved in favor of one side or the other. Good must triumph over evil. Order must triumph over chaos. Truth must triumph over falsehood. The resolution of the conflict is the goal. The persistence of the conflict is the problem. Egyptian thought reversed this valuation. For the Egyptians, the persistence of the conflict was the goal. The resolution of the conflict was the problem. If order triumphed over chaos permanently, the creative energy that the tension between them generated would cease, and the cosmos would stagnate. If chaos triumphed over order permanently, the structure that held the cosmos together would dissolve, and existence would return to the undifferentiated void from which it had emerged. The goal was not victory. The goal was balance, the maintenance of a dynamic equilibrium between opposing forces, each one necessary, each one dangerous, each one held in check by the other. The temple was the instrument of this balance. Every Egyptian temple, in its most fundamental function, was a machine for maintaining the cosmic equilibrium, a building in which the forces of order and the forces of chaos were brought into contact, managed, and kept in balance through the performance of daily rituals. The daily offering sustained the god, the representative of order. The daily recitation of the destruction myths contained the threat of chaos. The daily cycle of ritual, from the morning purification to the evening protection, maintained the balance between the two. At Kom Ombo, this function was made architecturally explicit. The two sides of the temple, Sobek's side and Haroeris's side, represented the two sides of the cosmic duality. Sobek represented the dangerous, unpredictable, potentially destructive forces of nature, the Nile, the flood, the crocodile. Haroeris represented the orderly, predictable, protective forces of the cosmos, the sky, the sun, the falcon. The temple contained both, not as a compromise but as a statement. The cosmos needs both. The cosmos is both. And the temple, as the microcosm of the cosmos, must contain both in equal measure. The symmetry of the temple was the visual expression of this equality. The two halves were not merely parallel, they were proportional, each one exactly the same size, the same shape, the same complexity as the other. The symmetry was not arbitrary, it was theological. It expressed the fundamental Egyptian conviction that the forces of nature and the forces of order are equal in power, equal in importance, equal in their claim on the attention of the worshipper. To give more space to Haroeris would be to deny the power of Sobek. To give more space to Sobek would be to deny the authority of Haroeris. Only equal space, only perfect symmetry, could express the truth that both forces were equally real, equally necessary, and equally divine. A modern visitor to Kom Ombo, walking through the ruined hypostyle hall, can still see the double axis. The division runs straight through the building, from the entrance to the back wall, splitting every architectural element into two. The columns on the left are Haroeris's. The columns on the right are Sobek's. The reliefs on the left depict the falcon god. The reliefs on the right depict the crocodile god. The sanctuaries at the back, two small dark rooms, side by side, separated by a thin wall, house the two divine residents. The division is visible, tangible, walkable. And the experience of walking along the division, of moving through a building that is simultaneously one and two, unified and split, whole and halved, is the experience of Egyptian duality made physical. The parallels between the Kom Ombo duality and modern philosophical concepts of complementarity are suggestive. The physicist Niels Bohr, who proposed the principle of complementarity in quantum mechanics, argued that certain phenomena, most notably light, which behaves as both a wave and a particle, cannot be adequately described by a single model. Two complementary models are needed, each one correct in its domain, each one incomplete without the other, each one describing a different aspect of the same underlying reality. The parallel with Egyptian duality is not exact. The Egyptians were not doing quantum physics, but the structural similarity is striking. Both systems recognize that reality is dual, that a single description is insufficient, that opposing descriptions can both be correct, that the truth lies not in the resolution of the paradox, but in the embrace of it. The embrace of paradox is the defining characteristic of the Temple of Kom Ombo. The building does not resolve the tension between Sobek and Haroeris. It contains it. It holds the two gods in the same space, under the same roof, in the same building, without merging them, without subordinating one to the other, without resolving the theological contradiction that their coexistence implies. The temple is the paradox made architectural, and the paradox, the coexistence of the dangerous and the protective, the chaotic and the orderly, the crocodile and the falcon, is the deepest truth that the building has to teach. The concept of Maat, the Egyptian principle of cosmic order, truth and justice, is the framework within which the Kom Ombo duality makes sense. Maat was not merely order. It was the right relationship between opposing forces, the balance that held the cosmos together, the equilibrium that prevented the created world from collapsing back into the undifferentiated void. Maat required the presence of its opposite, Isfet, disorder, injustice, chaos. Without Isfet, Maat had nothing to balance against, nothing to define itself against, nothing to maintain. The pharaoh's role and the temple's role was to maintain the balance between the two, not to eliminate chaos, but to keep it in its place, to manage it, to contain it, to ensure that the crocodile stayed in the water and the falcon stayed in the sky. The Temple of Kom Ombo was the physical expression of this management. The building contained both the crocodile and the falcon, both chaos and order, both Isfet and Maat, and held them in architectural equilibrium. The building was the balance, the symmetry was the mechanism, and the priests, serving both gods, performing both sets of rituals, maintaining both theological programs simultaneously, were the operators of the mechanism. They kept the balance, they maintained the equilibrium, they ensured that neither god outweighed the other, and their daily work, the repetitive, mundane, endlessly reiterated work of serving two gods in two sanctuaries in two halves of one building, was the work that kept the cosmos running. The concept of balance that the Temple of Kom Ombo embodies has resonances that extend far beyond Egyptian theology. The idea that opposing forces must be held in equilibrium, that the cosmos is sustained not by the victory of one force over another, but by the dynamic tension between them, is one of the most widespread and most enduring philosophical concepts in human history. The Chinese concept of yin and yang, the complementary opposites that together compose the whole of reality, is structurally similar to the Egyptian concept of Maat and Isfet. The Hindu concept of the divine triad, Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer, embodies a similar principle of cosmic balance, and the Western philosophical tradition, from Heraclitus's doctrine of the unity of opposites to Hegel's dialectic, has repeatedly returned to the idea that reality consists of opposing forces whose tension is the source of all dynamism, all creativity, all change. The Temple of Kom Ombo is the most literal architectural expression of this idea in the ancient world. Other buildings have symbolized duality. The double crown of the pharaoh, the twin towers of medieval cathedrals, the bilateral symmetry of classical temples. But no other building has literally divided itself along its center line to house two opposed divine forces. The double temple is not a symbol of duality. It is duality, made architectural, made spatial, made walkable. And the walkability is important. The visitor to Kom Ombo does not merely learn about duality. The visitor experiences it, physically, spatially, architecturally. The visitor enters the building and immediately encounters the choice, left or right, falcon or crocodile, sky or water. The visitor walks along the central axis and feels the two sides of the building, identical in form, different in content, pressing against each other like the two halves of a folded page. The visitor reaches the sanctuaries and sees the two doorways, side by side, identical in size, identical in shape, leading to two identical rooms that house two very different gods. The experience is not intellectual, it is physical. The body understands the duality before the mind does, and the understanding, the physical, spatial, architectural understanding of what it means for two opposed forces to coexist in the same space, is the temple's most valuable lesson. The double temple also teaches a lesson about tolerance, about the capacity of a religious system to accommodate competing claims without requiring the suppression of either. The worshippers of Sobek and the worshippers of Hareris shared a building. They shared a precinct. They shared festivals and resources and administrative structures. And they did so, apparently, without significant conflict, without the sectarian violence, the theological persecution, the institutional rivalry that has characterized so many religious coexistences throughout history. The tolerance at Kom Ombo was not accidental. It was structural, built into the architecture, encoded in the symmetry, enforced by the physical arrangement of spaces that gave each cult exactly the same resources as the other. The architecture prevented hierarchy. The symmetry prevented dominance. And the building, by its very design, made tolerance the default condition, a physical fact rather than a political choice. This architectural tolerance, this use of building design to structure social relationships, is a concept that modern architects and urban planners might profitably study. The design of public spaces, parks, plazas, community centers, civic buildings, shapes the behavior of the people who use them. Spaces that are designed for confrontation produce confrontation. Spaces that are designed for coexistence produce coexistence. And the Temple of Kom Ombo, designed more than 2,000 years ago to produce coexistence between competing religious communities, is one of the earliest and most successful examples of this principle in the history of architecture. The festival calendar at Kom Ombo, with its separate festivals for each god and its joint festivals for both, provides a model for how institutional coexistence can be managed in practice. The separate festivals allowed each community to celebrate its own traditions without interference. The joint festivals created opportunities for the two communities to come together, to share space, to share food, to share the experience of collective worship. The alternation between separation and togetherness, between the privacy of individual practice and the publicness of shared celebration, is a model of religious coexistence that is both ancient and surprisingly modern. The modern world struggles with religious pluralism, with the challenge of accommodating multiple religious communities within a single society. A single city, a single neighborhood, could benefit from the Kom Ombo model, not the specific theology. The worship of crocodile gods and falcon gods is not a viable option for the 21st century, but the structural principle, the principle that coexistence can be architecturally supported, that tolerance can be built into the design of shared spaces, that the physical arrangement of a building can shape the social dynamics of the community that uses it, is a principle that is as valid today as it was in the 2nd century BC. The Temple of Kom Ombo was designed to hold two gods in one building. It succeeded. For more than 4 centuries, the two cults coexisted in the double temple without significant conflict. The success was architectural. The building created the conditions for coexistence by making equality the default, by preventing hierarchy through symmetry, and by providing each community with exactly the same resources as the other. The architecture made the tolerance possible, the tolerance made the community possible, and the community, the diverse, multi-religious, multi-ethnic community of ancient Kom Ombo, prospered within the framework that the double temple provided. The building is damaged now. The roof is gone. The walls are broken. The river is eroding the bank. But the principle survives. The principle that coexistence is possible, that tolerance can be structured, that architecture can create the conditions for peace. The principle is carved in the temple's symmetry. It is encoded in the temple's double plan. It is expressed in every column, every doorway, every relief panel that mirrors its twin on the opposite side of the central axis. And the principle, like the stone it is carved in, is more durable than the building that contains it. The decorative program of the temple's exterior walls, particularly the outer ambulatory corridor that runs behind the sanctuaries, contains some of the most historically significant reliefs at Kom Ombo. In addition to the surgical instruments panel, the corridor walls display elaborate scenes of the pharaoh performing the foundation rituals of the temple, stretching the cord to define the axis, pouring sand into the foundation trench, laying the cornerstone, consecrating the building with fire and water. These foundation scenes are formulaic. They appear at virtually every Egyptian temple, but the versions at Kom Ombo are unusually detailed, providing information about construction procedures that supplements what we know from other sources. The exterior walls also contain extensive calendar inscriptions, texts that record the dates, the rituals, and the offerings associated with each festival in the temple's annual cycle. The calendar is arranged in registers, horizontal bands of hieroglyphic text, separated by carved lines, running the full length of the wall. The density of the text is extraordinary. Thousands of hieroglyphs per wall, each one carved with the precision that characterizes the best Ptolemaic work. The calendar provides information about festivals that are not well documented at other temples. Festivals specific to the Sobek and Haroeris cults, festivals associated with the crocodile and the falcon, festivals that reflect the particular religious geography of the Kom Ombo region. The outer ambulatory corridor also contains the reliefs that depict the mythological conflict between Horus and Seth, a narrative that is central to both the Haroeris cult and to Egyptian religion as a whole. The conflict, as depicted at Kom Ombo, follows the same broad outline as the versions at Edfu and at other temples: the murder of Osiris, the battle between Horus and Seth, the trial before the divine tribunal, the victory of Horus, and his installation as the legitimate king. But the Kom Ombo version includes episodes and details that are not found elsewhere, variations in the narrative, alternative versions of specific encounters, additional characters and events that enrich our understanding of how the myth was understood and transmitted in the Ptolemaic period. The persistence of the Horus-Seth myth across multiple temples and multiple centuries tells us something important about the nature of Egyptian mythological tradition. The myth was not fixed. It was fluid, adapting, evolving, acquiring new episodes and new interpretations as it was transmitted from generation to generation, from temple to temple, from priesthood to priesthood. The version at Edfu is different from the version at Kom Ombo, which is different from the version in the pyramid texts, which is different from the version in Plutarch. Each version reflects the theological priorities of the institution that produced it, and the multiplicity of versions, the fact that no single authoritative text of the myth exists, tells us that Egyptian mythology was not a canon but a conversation, a multi-generational, multi-institutional, multi-centennial conversation about the nature of the cosmos, conducted through the medium of myth, and preserved on the walls of the temples that housed it. The conversation continues at Kom Ombo. Despite the damage to the walls that carry it, the reliefs are legible, the myths are readable, the calendar is decipherable, and the scholars who study them, following in the footsteps of Champollion, De Morgan, and the generations of Egyptologists who have worked at the site, continue to extract information from the walls, to publish translations of the texts, and to deepen our understanding of a religious system that was, at its peak, one of the most sophisticated and most enduring in the history of human civilization. The temple endures as a document. Its walls are a library, its reliefs are a gallery, its inscriptions are an archive. And the archive, despite the damage, despite the erosion, despite the falling blocks and the encroaching river, is still open for consultation, still readable, still yielding new information with each new reading, still contributing to the ongoing project of understanding the civilization that created it, the civilization that worshipped crocodiles and falcons, that measured floods and performed surgery, that built temples to contain the cosmos, and that divided those temples along their center lines to express the fundamental duality of the world. The duality endures, the building endures, damaged, diminished, but enduring, and the river endures, flowing past the promontory, eating the bank, carrying the sand and the stone and the memory of 2,000 years of worship downstream toward the sea. The falcon watches from the western sanctuary. The crocodile waits in the eastern sanctuary. And between them, in the narrow space where the central axis divides the building, where the two worlds meet, where sky and water are separated by a line of stone, the balance holds. Precariously, beautifully, for now, stand at the edge of the promontory, at the point where the temple meets the river. Look down. The Nile is moving, dark, slow, powerful, ancient. The current sweeps past the base of the promontory, carrying silt, carrying memory, carrying the same water that carried the sacred crocodiles and the trading boats and the military galleys that once docked at this landing. The river has not changed. The bank has changed. The bank is retreating. Each year, a little more of the sandstone bedrock dissolves into the current. Each year, the temple moves a little closer to the edge. This is what happens to everything that is built on a boundary. Boundaries are dramatic. Boundaries are strategic. Boundaries are the places where the interesting things happen, where empires meet, where cultures collide, where gods of the water and gods of the sky share a single roof. But boundaries are also unstable. They shift, they erode, they dissolve. The boundary between Egypt and Nubia, which Kom Ombo was built to guard, has been redrawn many times. The boundary between the temple and the river, which the promontory was supposed to maintain, is being erased by the Nile. The temple was built on a boundary because boundaries were theologically significant. The boundary between the cultivated land and the desert. The boundary between the East Bank and the West Bank. The boundary between Egypt and Nubia. These were not merely geographical features. They were cosmic categories, divisions in the structure of reality that the temple was designed to mediate. Kom Ombo, positioned on the boundary between Egypt and Nubia, between the cultivated valley and the desert, between the Nile and the dry land, was a temple of boundaries, a building that existed at the intersection of categories, that mediated between opposing forces, that held the cosmos together at one of its seams. And the cosmos is coming apart at that seam. The river is eroding the bank. The desert is encroaching on the cultivated land. The categories that the temple was built to mediate are shifting. The boundary is moving, and the temple, standing on the moving boundary, is moving with it, toward the water, toward the chaos, toward the god of the crocodile who waits below. The irony is not lost on the archaeologists who work at the site. The temple of Sobek, the god of the Nile, the god of floods, the god of water, is being destroyed by water. The god whose worship was meant to protect the community from the dangers of the river is unable to protect his own temple from the same river. The worshippers propitiated the crocodile to keep the river at bay. The river came anyway. And the temple, the building that was supposed to be the guarantee, the insurance policy, the cosmic mechanism that kept the destructive forces of nature under control, is being pulled into the river by the very forces it was designed to contain. The relationship between Sobek and the Nile offers a meditation on the nature of worship that illuminates the entire history of Egyptian religion. The Egyptians worshipped the crocodile because the crocodile was dangerous. They did not worship the crocodile despite its danger. They worshipped it because of its danger. The worship was an acknowledgement, an honest, unsentimental recognition that the forces of nature are powerful, unpredictable, and indifferent to human welfare. The crocodile does not care about the farmer whose field it swims through. The Nile does not care about the settlement it floods. The forces of nature act according to their own logic, a logic that is not malicious but that is also not benign. And the worship of those forces, the worship of Sobek, the worship of the Nile, the worship of the crocodile, was not an attempt to change the logic. It was an attempt to participate in it, to align human activity with the rhythms of the natural world, to find within the danger a principle of order that could be understood, respected, and, to a limited extent, managed. This attitude toward nature, respectful, realistic, unsentimental, is one of the most distinctive features of Egyptian religion. The Egyptians did not romanticize nature. They did not sentimentalize animals. They did not pretend that the crocodile was cute or that the Nile was gentle. They acknowledged the reality, the teeth, the current, the unpredictable violence of the natural world, and they found, within that reality, something worthy of worship, not because the violence was beautiful, but because the violence was real, and reality, in Egyptian theology, was divine. The double temple of Kom Ombo, housing both the crocodile god and the falcon god, was the architectural expression of this attitude. The building contained the dangerous and the protective in equal measure. It did not pretend that the world was safe. It did not promise that the gods would protect the worshipper from all harm. It said, instead, that the world contains both danger and protection, that both are real, that both are divine, that both must be acknowledged and honored. The worshipper who entered the temple entered a world that was honest about the nature of existence, a world that contained the crocodile and the falcon, the water and the sky, the threat and the promise. The temple was not an escape from reality. It was an engagement with it, an engagement that was structured, ritualized, and architecturally framed, but that was, at its core, an acknowledgement of the world as it actually is. The modern relevance of this engagement is worth considering. Modern civilization tends to insulate its members from the natural world, from the dangers, the unpredictabilities, the raw power of the forces that the Egyptians worshipped. We control the Nile with dams. We fence the crocodiles behind barriers. We air condition our buildings against the heat. We illuminate our nights against the darkness. We have, to an unprecedented degree, separated ourselves from the natural world that the Egyptians engage with daily. And in doing so, we have lost something that the Temple of Kom Ombo preserves: the awareness that the natural world is powerful, that it is indifferent to our welfare, that it must be respected, and that the forces it contains, the floods, the predators, the earthquakes, are not problems to be eliminated, but realities to be managed. The temple managed them, the rituals managed them, the worship of Sobek and Haroeris managed them, and the management was not an illusion. The priests who served the temple were also the administrators who managed the irrigation canals, who predicted the flood, who organized the harvest, who distributed the grain. The worship was not separate from the practical management of the natural world. It was integrated with it. The ritual and the practical, the sacred and the mundane, woven together in a single institutional framework that managed both the material and the spiritual needs of the community. We have separated what the Egyptians combined. We have separated religion from economics, worship from governance, the sacred from the practical. The separation has brought enormous benefits: specialization, efficiency, the scientific revolution, the material prosperity of the modern world. But it has also brought costs: the loss of a unified worldview, the fragmentation of community, the alienation of the individual from the natural world, the feeling, widespread in the modern West, and increasingly in the modern East, that something is missing, that something has been lost, that the world is efficient but not meaningful, productive but not sacred. The Temple of Kom Ombo does not offer a solution to this modern malaise. It is a ruin, a damaged, eroded, partially collapsed ruin on the bank of a river that is slowly consuming it. It cannot be restored to its original function. It cannot house its gods again. It cannot resume its rituals. But it can offer a reminder, a physical, architectural, stone and limestone reminder, that there was once a way of being in the world that combined the practical and the sacred, that acknowledged the danger and the beauty of nature simultaneously, that found divine meaning in the teeth of the crocodile and the flight of the falcon, and that expressed this meaning in a building of extraordinary ambition. A building that dared to house two gods under one roof, that divided itself along its center line to contain two theological programs simultaneously, and that stood, for more than 2 millennia, on a promontory above the Nile, facing the river, facing the sunset, facing the future, with the calm, symmetrical, double-sided confidence of a building that knew exactly what it was doing. The building knew what it was doing. The question is whether we do. The Nile at Kom Ombo has not merely damaged the temple. It has reshaped the temple's relationship with its landscape and, by extension, its meaning. The original temple was set back from the river's edge, positioned on the highest point of the promontory, commanding a view of the Nile in both directions. The approach from the river, up the stone stairway, across the terrace, through the gateway, was designed to create a sense of ascent, of rising from the level of the water to the level of the sacred. The temple was above the river. The temple controlled the river. The temple looked down on the water from a position of architectural authority. 2 millennia of erosion have changed this relationship. The promontory has retreated. The temple is now closer to the river's edge than its builders intended. The sense of ascent, of rising from the water to the sacred, has been diminished by the loss of the intervening terrain. The temple no longer commands the river. The river is encroaching on the temple, and the balance of power between the building and the landscape has shifted. From a relationship of dominance, the temple above the river, to a relationship of vulnerability, the temple beside the river and the river closing in. This shift is visible in the architecture. The eastern wall of the temple, Sobek's wall, the wall closest to the river, has been undermined and partially collapsed. The stones that once formed this wall have fallen down the slope of the promontory, and, in some cases, into the river itself. The stones are still visible, scattered down the slope, half buried in the sand and rubble, their carved surfaces facing skyward, their hieroglyphs readable but exposed to the elements. These fallen stones are among the most poignant objects at Kom Ombo, blocks that were once part of a wall that separated the sacred from the profane, now lying in the rubble between the temple and the river, casualties of the geological process that is slowly consuming the promontory. The fallen stones have been studied by archaeologists who have attempted to determine their original position in the temple's walls. Some blocks can be matched with gaps in the surviving masonry, others cannot. Their original positions are unknown, their context lost, their contribution to the temple's decorative program unrecoverable. Each fallen block is a piece of a puzzle that is missing more and more pieces with each passing century. The puzzle will never be completed. The river will continue to undermine the bank. More blocks will fall, more contexts will be lost. And the puzzle, the architectural puzzle, the decorative puzzle, the theological puzzle that the temple's walls were designed to solve, will become, year by year, decade by decade, century by century, less complete. The conservation strategy at Kom Ombo has focused on stabilization rather than reconstruction. Unlike some Egyptian temples, where fallen columns have been re-erected and missing blocks have been replaced with new stone, Kom Ombo has been conserved largely in its ruined state, stabilized against further collapse but not rebuilt. The decision reflects a modern conservation philosophy that values authenticity over completeness, that prefers a genuine ruin to an artificial reconstruction, that accepts the damage as part of the monument's history rather than trying to erase it. This philosophy, the acceptance of damage as authentic, the preference for ruin over reconstruction, is itself a form of the duality that the temple embodies. The conservator must hold two opposing values simultaneously: the value of preservation, which argues for intervention, for stabilization, for the prevention of further loss, and the value of authenticity, which argues against intervention, against reconstruction, against the introduction of new material that would alter the monument's historical character. The conservator, like the priests of Kom Ombo, must maintain a balance between two competing principles, and the balance, like the temple's symmetry, must be exact. The temple at Kom Ombo is, in this reading, a metaphor for its own conservation, a building that embodies the principle of balanced duality, conserved by professionals who must practice balanced duality in their approach to the building. The symmetry is the lesson, the balance is the method, and the result, a ruin that is stabilized but not rebuilt, damaged but not destroyed, incomplete but legible, is a monument to the same principle of dynamic equilibrium that the temple's builders inscribed on its walls 2,200 years ago. The sunset at Kom Ombo occurs to the west, behind the temple, beyond the river, beyond the desert. The last light of the day catches the western face of the remaining columns, turning them from white to gold to amber to rose. The shadows lengthen across the ruined floor. The river, dark now, flows past the base of the promontory with the quiet persistence of something that has been doing the same thing for thousands of years, and that will continue doing it for thousands more. The tourists have departed, the guards are closing the gates, and the temple, damaged, eroded, half collapsed, but still standing, still symmetrical, still holding the falcon and the crocodile in its two halves, settles into the darkness that it has inhabited every night for more than 2,000 years. The darkness is familiar. The temple knows the dark. It has been dark for 22 centuries of nights. And in the dark, in the silence that follows the tourists and precedes the dawn, the two gods resume their positions, the falcon in the west, the crocodile in the east, sky and water, order and chaos, protection and danger, held in balance, held in stone, held in the symmetry that no earthquake, no flood, no chisel has been able to break. The balance holds, the temple endures. And the river of the crocodile god, the river that gives life and takes life, the river that built Egypt and that is, stone by stone, taking Kom Ombo apart, flows on, indifferent, eternal, beautiful, dangerous, divine. So what is the temple of Kom Ombo? It is the only double temple in ancient Egypt, a building divided down its center line to serve two gods, the crocodile god Sobek and the falcon god Haroeris, in perfect architectural symmetry. It was built primarily during the Ptolemaic period, between roughly 180 and 47 BC, with later additions by Roman emperors. It stands on a sandstone promontory on the east bank of the Nile, 45 kilometers north of Aswan, at a bend in the river where the current is strong and the erosion is relentless. Its walls contain the oldest known depictions of surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, bone saws, and dental probes carved in stone 2,000 years ago. Its grounds contain a nilometer, a 16-meter deep well connected to the river by tunnels, used to predict the annual flood and to calculate the tax rate. Its catacombs contain hundreds of mummified crocodiles, sacred animals, wrapped in linen, adorned with jewelry, preserved with the same care as human kings. And its secret corridor, the narrow passage between the two sanctuaries, reveals a tradition of oracular stagecraft that blurs the boundary between religion and theatre. The temple has been damaged by earthquakes, eroded by the Nile, defaced by Christians, quarried by builders, and exposed to 2,000 years of Upper Egyptian climate. It is not intact. It is not complete. It is not the best preserved temple in Egypt, but it is in its ruined, eroded, half-collapsed state, one of the most eloquent, because the ruin speaks. It speaks of a building that was designed to contain two opposing forces, the water and the sky, the crocodile and the falcon, chaos and order, and that has been, over the course of 2 millennia, progressively consumed by one of them. The water is winning, the sky is watching, and the temple, balanced on the edge of the promontory, holds the tension between the two with a grace that is, somehow, enhanced rather than diminished by its damage. Visit Kom Ombo at sunset. The light is golden. The river is dark. The columns cast long shadows across the ruined floor. The relief of the surgical instruments glows on the back wall. The nilometer plunges into the bedrock. The crocodile mummies lie in their museum, wrapped in ancient linen, their jaws slightly open, their painted eyes staring at a ceiling they will never see. And the two sanctuaries, Sobek's on the east, Haroeris on the west, stand side by side in the gathering dark, two empty rooms, two absent gods, two halves of a building that was designed to hold the cosmos together, and that the cosmos, slowly, patiently, century by century, is taking apart. The falcon watches from above, the crocodile waits below, and the temple, the double temple, the twin sanctuary, the only building in Egypt that dared to house two gods under one roof, holds the line between them, for now, for a little longer, until the river decides otherwise. The columns stand, the river flows, and the balance, the architectural balance, the theological balance, the balance between the sky and the water, between order and chaos, between the falcon and the crocodile, endures. Not because the temple is permanent, but because the duality it represents is permanent. The water will always threaten, the sky will always watch, the crocodile will always wait, and somewhere, in a temple, in a ruin, in a memory, in a story told at 2 in the morning to someone who is drifting towards sleep, the falcon and the crocodile will share a roof, will share a wall, will share the silence of a building that held the cosmos in two perfect halves, and that the cosmos, in its own good time, written to one.